Hello, and welcome to the Wade Borth podcast. I'm your host, Wade Borth, and in every episode, my goal is to get you to think differently about how money works and ultimately to empower you to take control of your money and your personal financing system. They'll talk, I got 27% on the stock I bought, which they had, they bought 1,000 shares of XYZ stock and they got 27%. $27, all that time and effort for $27. They're focusing on the wrong thing.
Yeah. Or it could be similar to a lady that I talked to several weeks ago who searches for bank offers of you open an account, put so much money in, and if you have 6 deposits over a 6-month period of time, we'll give you $250 or whatever that is. She searches those out so that she can get the free $150, $250 from the bank instead of focusing on all we've been talking about.
Yeah, it's kind of like the magic trick or the guy on the street that's going to steal your wallet. You remember this, I remember this. Remember the days, back in the days when the banks used to give you a free toaster or whatever the heck it was, right?
Yes.
Come and open an account, you get this free toaster. So we're all enamored with, this free toaster. So we all ran over this free toaster. What we don't look behind the curtain and say, what are they doing with my money? They understand that free toaster costs them almost nothing. But then once your money's there, what do they do with it? They turn it 5, 10, 20 times in a year, and they're making anywhere between 300 and 700% markup on that money. They have us all distracted with what's going on the left hand while they're making millions of dollars with our deposit with our right hand. And so if that gal would take the same time and effort to understand what the bank is doing with her money versus what they're quote unquote giving her, because they're not giving her anything. To them it's just a small cost of doing business, but she's not willing to take the time or the effort to understand how they're making money in the banking system. And then come to the realization that she can do that herself. Again, there goes back to the problem. She can do this in her own family financing system herself if she just takes that same principle. And if it's the $250, that's the left hand, right, to getting your attention, taking your focus on what's really important. It goes back to the same thing we just talked about. The distraction is focusing on the extra 1 or 2 or 5% that they can earn on that $10,000 if they're really making or saving $10,000 versus taking control of the $35,000 or $40,000 that they're paying out in financing charges to other institutions. Taking control, that's the real benefit, not the sleight of hand that's going on the other hand that's grabbing your attention.
Yeah.
But that's a great example, right? She's spending all that time and money for $250 where she understood what was going on. If she had been talking with you, Red Nelson, she could be giving away $250 to capture $25,000 so she could turn that and make a tremendous amount of markup. Think about that. If I could give you $250, Nicole, and I could have your money for a year or 6 months or whatever the amount is, and I can make $50,000 off of it, how many toasters would you want to buy? How many toasters as a business would I buy that I could get you to do that?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes, nowadays they'd probably be giving away like iPads or iPhones or something.
That's when I was a kid, they'd give away toasters and other stuff to open an account, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And just a really good example of the problem. And I shared this story with somebody actually earlier this week, and I had a lot of heads nodding, and it's a great example of what we're talking about. So I don't know if you have this where you live in Indiana. I know you do because actually I've been to some restaurants in your neck of the woods. But some of the better steakhouses, I'm a steakhouse guy. I love steakhouse food. Right? And I see it here where I live here in Fargo. They're doing this. And so I went into the restaurant, and it was a new restaurant. Well, actually been around a while. We just hadn't, because of COVID and all the other stuff, we hadn't been there yet. So we go in there, and we go into the restaurant, and I'm looking at the menu, and they say our ranch. This beef comes from our ranch that's out in Amadon, North Dakota. And nobody knows where Amadon, North Dakota is at because it's a bar and a restaurant and I think a post office, and that's all that's there. But it's out in ranch country, out in western North Dakota. They say we own this ranch out here and we grow our own beef. And then come to find out that they have a hydroponics operation in Minnesota where they grow their own lettuce and vegetables and stuff like that. And then they have a vineyard just south of town where they grow their own grapes and make their own wine. So what's happening is that this restaurant is buying and taking control of the supply chain in their operation. Why are they doing that? So I talked to the guy because he's just like, it was so enamoring to me. I'm like, why are you doing that? And he says, for one thing, we control that supply chain, so we're getting a better product. We have more control. We don't have to worry about trucks not being able to deliver a lot of our stuff. We're not going to be out of business because we can't get beef out of, Chicago or wherever their beef is coming from. We can't get vegetables out of Mexico whatever it is. Not that they have 100% control of their supply chain, but they have more than the rest of the restaurants around here have. And so people go there and they're enjoying a meal, and the restaurateur now, he doesn't have to worry about those things. What he does, and this is the discussion we had, I said, so do you get your beef from your cattle operation for free? He goes, oh, absolutely not. He says, we charge so that cattle operation is just as profitable as our restaurant. And now what's happened, he's been in business long enough where people, other competition is seeing that. So now he's got his competition buying from him as well. So they're buying part of his supply chain. So how is that any different than what we're teaching? We get people to understand what the problem was. They understood what the problem was. It was the supply chain and people having the ability to say you can't have beef or pork or vegetables or wine or whatever it is. He saw that as the problem. Well, think about it in our context of what we're doing, Nicole, here. So we're talking about the flow of money, right? So we need a warehouse of dollars. So when we want to put it into play to run our business or to take advantage of opportunities or whatever it might be, we want to own the full supply chain, or at least as much of that supply chain as we can. So the bank can't come back and say, hey, wait, I know this might be a great idea to buy this land at $1,000 an acre and sell it at $2,000 an acre. But credit is so tight today that we're not going to do it. And that's happened in the past. There's great opportunities to be had when you have access to cash. But we've abdicated the supply chain of our cash and our capital to somebody else.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, Wade, too. And it's one of the things that was difficult in the beginning for me to wrap my head around, in that your cash is a commodity, or it isn't. There's nothing different about it than beef, other than it's cash instead of beef.
Right.
So people need beef to eat or to run their restaurants, and go to this guy because he has beef that he's growing and he can sell them the beef. If you have cash, people need money to do things, buy cars or buy land or start a business. They can come to you and buy that cash.
Yep, 100%. So now, again, we control our own supply chain. That's the first step. And then once we're good at that and we have that constant supply when we need it to the amount we need, then when we look and say, oh, do we have extra capacity? Now should we be selling or using it with, I don't want to call it our competition, but other people that maybe that would like to tap into that supply chain. Before we got on for this podcast, I actually had a guy text me saying, hey, do you know anybody that's in the IBC world that is willing to do some, what do you call venture capitalists? He's looking to borrow money from IBC practitioners and people that are practicing IBC. So now he's coming with an offer saying, hey, I need some cash. Would you be willing to fund this? This is what's going to happen once your operation is up and running. And now, who's the one that's in control, right? Now you're the banker. You're the one that's I'm going to give him a toaster type of thing. And then what we're going to do, hopefully, is we'll take our money, we'll put it to work and make the type of returns that banks are making. And maybe not that much, because again, I think if we did what the existing banking structure is doing today, we'd all go to jail. But the point is taking the same thought process that banks do and apply it to what we do with our money.
Yeah, and it all goes back to this chapter in the beginning of imagination. So using your imagination and thinking outside the box about what possibilities are out there. So This guy knows that people have cash in policies and has an opportunity for those people to invest in whatever it is that he's got going. When I first learned about IBC, I was thinking about it in terms of only my own world and my own life, not about advertising, quote unquote advertising, that, hey, my bank is open and I can loan money to customers that I believe in.
Which could be your children for the things they're going to buy. This is not new to the world. The Rockefellers of this world have been doing this for a century. So It's not like it's a new idea. It's just that we haven't opened our mind up enough to hear that these words are out there, because again, we've been conditioned to think that the only place to get money is to go to the bank. And so you get somebody to supply them with the money and then somebody to take that out. Well, all we're talking about is controlling the supply chain. We're going to be our best customers to begin with because we're going to eat at our own restaurant, but eventually people will start buying from our supply chain as well. One of the things that I was going to bring up too is that with this guy, he actually owned the cattle ranch for about 10 years. So one of the things we talked about is like this idea that you and I are talking about doesn't happen overnight. It is a process. Really, it becomes a lifelong process because there's so many people that want immediate gratification. But if they truly understand what's going on here, is that this guy took 10 years to build his cattle ranch. Then he opened his restaurant, and then he went and bought and this has been, a 10-year process for this guy to get where he's at now. In Nelson's book, it took him 13 years to get away from the snakes and dragons, as he called it. And so understanding what the problem is, again, from this podcast, is that we have to focus on the right thing, get away from focusing on the small thing, and focus on the big thing. And I was having a conversation with a real estate investor, and I asked him this question. I said, what's your biggest issues? And he goes, money, right? Access to money. I said, well, tell me more about that. And it came down to this, right? He kind of understands what his problem is. His problem is that he doesn't like to go to banks because the process of getting money from the bank is painful. He doesn't like the timing because when he's ready to move, the banks are still dragging their feet, or they need 14 people to put a stamp of approval on his business. And he doesn't like the contracts he has to sign with the banks because they always favor the bank. And then how and when the money is paid back. That's a huge thing that was just driving him absolutely crazy. Because there's loans out there that doesn't allow him to pay it back early. Or these are the terms set by somebody else. And so he understood the problem in his situation was with everybody else having the ability to veto this process anywhere along the way, he's never really in control of his business. Goes back to the restaurateur, the same thing. He understood that if anybody along the way, a supply chain, anywhere along the way was disrupted, he's not in control of his business. So that's the same thing issue that we're having. I talked to his colleague, his real estate investor is probably the guy with all the money. He said, well, I use cash. We got a war chest that we use to finance everything we do. I'm like, okay, which is one step better than being indebted to the bank. So then I asked him, I said, well, when you use that war chest, when you use that money, what type of process do you have that you have to pay back that money? He looked at me like, what do you mean? I said, when you go to Wells Fargo, you go to any other bank, and you've heard me say this 1,000 times, and I got other podcasts that says you have to love yourself and your family more than you love Wells Fargo. But most people don't get that because they don't understand what that's part of their problem. So I said, what's your process? And he goes, we don't have a process. I said, well, you have to have a process. Because if you don't, then the money, a lot of times, maybe doesn't get paid back. And if you don't pay the money back, then how do you know it's a good deal for the real estate guy? I said, let's talk about the process. And then the other thing about the guy at cash, he says, I hate having cash sitting around because it has no value. I said, what do you mean it has no value, right? This goes back to what you talked about. He goes, yeah, it has no value. I said, yeah, that's because you put value, the value you're putting on your cash is what the bank is putting on for an interest rate. That's how he judges value.
Yeah.
He doesn't see it as an external use of his money. And I said, what if you could store your money like Wells Fargo stores their money? 20% or $20 billion of Wells Fargo money sits in properly structured life insurance policies. I said, what if you took part of what your money was and stored it in properly structured life insurance, so if you're not using it, it's doing better than sitting in cash or sitting at a 0.25% interest rate? Wouldn't that be a better solution? And so it really had him step back and think about the process and then the product that we're using. So again, it goes back to that whole thing. He understood what his problem was. He wanted a better solution. And then we talked about the process, and then we said, what's the best tool that fits the process that we're doing and solves that solution? Here is the solution to that problem.
It's interesting because this chapter about the problem is really talking a lot about the disparity between the interest that we're paying to other people and the fact that we're not in control of that. The disparity between the interest that we're paying, the interest that we're earning, the fact that we're not in control of that. But just listening to you and listening to the stories about the restaurateur and the cattle rancher and this real estate guy, it just takes it a little bit deeper in that the problem is truly that we don't understand how money works. We just don't understand. We are not taught that. It's not something that's just passed along in most families from generation to generation. And so we go into every decision that we're making financially with a skewed mindset.
Exactly right. We have a preconceived paradigm that we go into these situations with. And so the biggest problem, quite frankly, we probably could have summed it up in 2 minutes, is that we have to change our paradigm. We have to change how we think the ultimate outcome has to be, or where our starting point is.
We think
change
the
that,
world's
shift
flat,
that.
and in fact, we're going to sail off the end when in fact it's round, and we're just going to sail all the way.
Exactly. Until you have those big aha moments, and I've had them many times in my journey with IBC. I'm like you. I grew and progressed in my thought process many times. Hopefully that never stops.
Yeah.
How many times have you said, I just never thought of it that way, or I never thought about the different situations you and I talk about? How many times does that ever come up?
Yeah, about every time.
Yeah. And so part of it isn't just thinking that you have to discover this on your own. Quite frankly, what we're trying to do is build a community to think differently, right? We want people to surround themselves with like-minded individuals that say, I get this. I want to take control of the banking function of my life. And if I can find two or three of the people in my sphere of influence that want to change that too, are willing to take some time to study Nelson's book, talk to a practitioner like you or Nicole, and really take control of that function in their lives, then we have a better community, because then you have people to challenge your thought process and say, is this the way you think you should be doing it? It's not just us being the guides, because again, I don't want to be that gatekeeper. I want to empower you to take control of that. Sometimes empowering you means empowering you and those around you to be able to take control of that banking function. So
Good.
and I think Nelson said it in his book too. Everything you do in the financial world is compared with what everybody else is doing. So compare yourself to people that want to get better versus people that don't, right? Identify the problem. Say, I want to move beyond that. I want to change my environment. And then surround yourself with those that want to do the same thing, that want to surround them, that want a better environment.
Yeah.
Stop focusing on the little stuff.
Yeah. And he writes down here at the very end, in the very last paragraph of this, somehow or another, it never dawns on most financial gurus that you can control the financial environment in which you operate.
Yeah. And then in the very last sentence too, and that's a great paragraph too, he goes, learning to control that environment is the most profitable thing that you can do over a lifetime.
Yeah. That's really
Learning
powerful.
to control it that environment is the most profitable thing you can do over a lifetime. It doesn't say in a year or 2 years or 5 years, over your lifetime.
Yeah, that's
Then
really powerful.
It's huge, and it's probably the best way to leave it, because ultimately one of my founding principles is to make this multiple generational, right? Multi-generational. I don't want to have my son be conditioned to think a certain way and then have to unlearn that at 35 years old like I had to do it.
Mm-hmm.
I want to start teaching him now so he has an understanding, and just even a partial understanding of what we're talking about, because we never fully get there. I'm not fully there yet. I'm still learning, still progressing. Hopefully we'll get him so much ahead of everybody else that are his peers, because he's understanding at least parts of this as we go along. You're not going to be able to absorb all this in one sitting, in one conversation. This is a lifetime process. It starts with our ability to want to change our paradigm. It starts with that process there, understanding what the problem is and wanting to change our
Desiring
paradigm.
a solution.
Yep, exactly. Again, finding a practitioner like you or I to work with, and hopefully we can guide you along your way. We don't want to be that gatekeeper. We just want to guide you and empower you to take control of that environment. So I'll leave you with the last word. What do you have? Anything? I know I've done most of the talking here, but I get pretty worked up about this because it is so, to me, it's become so passionate, because there's such an opportunity for people to take control and see what's going in, finding ways out of that financial bondage that we think that there's no solution to.
Yeah. I mentioned to you earlier before we started this that have been, for sure, over the course of the last 2 years, times where I've stepped away from this and gone, is this really what I think it is? And every time I come back and I read and dig in, I'm like, I just don't know how we missed this all of these years. I just don't know how we missed it. I don't know how, as a society, I do know, but it's just mind-boggling to me that we have a whole country, a whole world of people that don't understand this concept. And it's so simple, and yet it's not necessarily easy. The concept is so simple, and yet it takes time and it takes a lot of digging in to really go, oh, okay, I get it now.
You're right. It's simple because we try not to put up any barriers. Where I think a lot of people that want to be gatekeepers put up a lot of barriers, so you see value in them opening the curtains for you. Where I want to make the barriers here are simple. Anybody can do this. Nelson actually said it in this chapter. He says you don't need to have millions of dollars to do this. You start where you can start, and then you progress from that point going forward.
Yeah.
Thank you again. I know I have to give you the last word, but it's my podcast, so I'll have the last word.
There you go. You're in
So,
control of it, right? It's your podcast.
yeah, exactly. Again, thank you for listening to the Wade Borth podcast. I'm looking forward to further chapters with Nicole. You've been great as we learn and go through the journey of IBC. This has been fabulous. So thank you again for your time, and looking forward to our next call.
I'm looking forward to it as well. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Nicole. If you're enjoying this podcast or know anyone else that might be interested, please be sure to hit the subscribe button and please leave a review. This will help this podcast reach and help more people by ranking higher in searches and ultimately help more people get out of financial bondage. And don't be afraid to share this podcast with your friends and family, as we can be easily found on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.